This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing fantastic, man, and I survived last night. Tonight, we've got karaoke. Are you ready?
Well, I'm ready because I'm just going to be sitting there watching.
Yeah. Well, I have to make sure that I don't end up as hoarse at the end of today. We're doing a lot of recording over here at Identiverse. And by the way, we're doing this Nostradamus Week idea. I think it's been going really well. What do you think?
Yeah, we've got some good predictions. We've had some great guests. We've got another one today we'll get to in a second. It's interesting to see Identiverse this year. AI's there, decentralized identity. It seems like all the future stuff is starting to become more prevalent as topics within things. But there's a lot of new speakers too, like that people just haven't seen before, which has been pretty cool. So I'm digging that.
Yeah. I think everybody's like real open to networking here as well. So all those new speakers, they like we were talking about before, like you can learn so much from these individuals who are out there in the real world, just like our listeners, implementing identity and access management technologies, and they just have so much knowledge to share. And I think what's great about our industry is that people are so willing to share that knowledge.
Yes, definitely. That is like one of the highlights for sure. I think I even mentioned that in our conversation. We talked about Andre Durand yesterday. I think I came up during that. So yeah, it was good times.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't point this out, but he was one of the few people who said, I chose identity.
Yeah, he absolutely did. It's a rare bird, but
yeah. Well, it's just also to think about like, PlainID and the size of PlainID. And he's like talking about like his first day was just him. His inbox was empty and he had no emails. And, I just picture that in my head. I'm like, that is absolutely insane.
It's funny. Everyone talks about like inbox zero and your crazy inbox and stuff like that. And some people thrive on that. And some people are like, oh my gosh, I have way too many emails when they're going to get done. It's interesting to see the dichotomy between the two. It's like people who keep a clean inbox or have nothing versus an inbox that's just jam-packed with stuff.
Yeah, so I had a client, I won't identify who it was, but he had gotten so far behind on his email that he, quote-unquote, declared email bankruptcy. So that meant if you've emailed me and you're expecting a response, you will not be getting a response from that email, so you need to email me again.
It's like the big reset button.
It's the big reset.
Yeah. Kind of wish you could do that for a few different things. All right, why don't we get to our guest for today? She's very, very gracious to gift us some of her time. She is Gal Helemski. She's the co-founder and chief product officer at PlainID. Welcome to the show, Gal.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yes, you're all the way coming from Tel Aviv, I believe, Israel.
Yes.
We're suffering various versions of jet lag. Yours is probably a little bit worse than mine at this point. But this is the first time you've been on the show, and we like to learn more a bit about identity origin stories. I actually met you several years ago. I think when PlainID was just kind of starting out, and it seems like you guys have grown quite a bit since then.
Yes, we have.
So this is a conversation that's definitely worth having and has been probably long overdue. Before we get to that, though, how did you get into the identity and access management space? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Well, I think it chose me, actually. I started studying physics, not even computer science. I did combine it a bit with computer science. But once in Israel, there's a military service that we are doing. Right after that, I started working for a company called Memco. Not sure if you know Memco, but it was one of the first cybersecurity companies in Israel, and they invented single sign-on. So maybe you know some of the other names of that product, such as Proxima SSO, Control SA, and so on. So that's how I started my IAM journey. After that, I joined CyberArk, which you probably all know, right? So again, an identity company. And from there, that was my primary focus: security, identity and access management, and now PlainID.
So for those who aren't familiar with PlainID, the authorization company, I believe, tell us about it. Give us what's the 30-second 60-second hallway Identiverse pitch if somebody's like, oh, what does what does PlainID do?
Yeah, so PlainID is the authorization company. Authorization is connecting identities to digital assets, right? We enable organizations to manage, to control authorization policies in a consistent way, a centralized way, and enforce those authorization policies in the different technologies which organizations have today, whether those are applications, APIs, microservices, and data. So that's the 30 seconds about authorizations, but we are going to talk more about that, right?
Yeah, we're going to get into PBAC, ABAC, RBAC, all the BACs, I'm sure. Authorizations are really hard to do cross-application, cross-cloud. I'd love to get a little bit more about how you kind of approach that. Before we get to that, we were kind of talking a little bit before we hit record here around introductions, and it's like, okay, we've got Gal, she's the chief product officer, but you also do CTO work as well, and you kind of had this interesting spin, which I totally get and it makes sense. I was originally going to introduce you as CTO/CPO, product officer, not privacy.
C3PO?
Yeah, C3PO. But you had this interesting response. Why did we settle on the introduction of chief product officer and not both?
Yeah, so I believe that product should lead technology and not the other way around. Eventually, we are building products for our customers. We are not throwing technology on them that they can't really use. And that's why I believe product should be the primary focus. Product should be using the technology options which are available to the best way it is possible, and not the other way around. You can't just get in love with technology and then try to turn it into a product. I think it should be the other way around, because sometimes you need to choose other technologies that can better fit what your customers are actually asking. I love that connection between customer requirements, customer needs, to the technology that can address them in the best way. So,
if I could give a standing ovation, I would, because I love the idea of identity as a product. Even if you are a product company, even within an organization, identity is a product that you're serving to your constituents, employees, vendors, consumers, whatever it may be. So, I don't have my soundboard here, but standing applause.
I like that concept, Jeff. I mean, you're putting together a product, and if nobody's buying it, that ought to be an indication that it doesn't have a lot of value.
Mm-hmm. Or something's wrong, right? It could be value, could be awareness. Maybe you've got wrong assumptions, but yeah. Nobody builds something and hopes it doesn't get used, except maybe disaster recovery, which is kind of a weird way, but
yeah, right.
I get where you're going with it.
Yeah. So Gal, you're the co-founder of PlainID, and you talk a lot about PBAC. Can you give us an overview of what PBAC is?
Yes, I'm going to start with what PBAC is not. PBAC is not marketing, just marketing. Some people might argue, but I do want to emphasize there has been development in that phase. PBAC is a way to manage authorization policies. That's PBAC, a management method. And if you look at how this space has evolved, it started with ACLs. We all know ACLs, right? Access control list. That was the very first way we started managing authorizations, and then it evolved into role-based access control to try and simplify how we manage authorization. That ended up in role explosion. We are also all familiar with that. ABAC, attribute-based access control, try to maybe solve some of those challenges. ABAC is eventually the method of leveraging attributes from the identity and the asset or the resource the identity is trying to access, defining the combining relationship between them, and then making decision based on that. But it did also lack some stuff. It was very technical. It didn't include all the processes which are required. And then came PBAC. And PBAC is not a replacement. I mean, it's very important to understand PBAC is a method of management. It includes, yes, ABAC policies. It leverages attributes, but it also uses roles. Roles is just another attribute of the identity. We can't throw away roles. We can't do it because we don't know everything about the identity. So that's really PBAC. One, business policies, life cycle of how policies should be handled within the organization, and then enforcement, different methods, because so many technologies are out there.
Can you give an example? Because I do think that, I don't think people confuse PBAC with RBAC so much. I think people have that concept down. But PBAC and ABAC, and I think you pointed that out, is people think it's the same thing. Can you give an example of PBAC that will kind of highlight that difference?
Yes, so ABAC started as a very technical notion. Let's leverage attributes to define connections between identities and assets, right? That's ABAC, that's very clear. But it doesn't include the processes. Eventually, we know authorization should be governed, should be audited, should be managed. There's a life cycle to all of that. And that is what PBAC brings to the table. The policy is not just a technical tool. It's also a business representation of the decision the organization wants to implement within their systems, right? So it needs to be expressed in that way. It needs to go through a life cycle, through the processes of the organization, development, staging, production, how that looks like, right? It needs to have some kind of review process, simulation maybe. Those are all elements of the policy system that the organization...
Yeah, I think... So shout out to Paul Volution, friend of the show, one of your employees there at PlainID, and he actually made the introduction to get you here today. But he had given me a demo, and kind of one of my big takeaways was that, the PBAC system could pull data attributes that were maybe traditionally identity data, or they're not like in your LDAP, right? You could pull this data and start to build an Uber profile of a person, now apply the policy to it, and now you've got something that's, a force multiplier, if you will.
Exactly. It sits on top of all those attributes that are being pulled about, both the identity, by the way, and the assets the identity is trying to access. So leveraging both sides in order to make the decision. Yeah.
Where does PBAC fit from a strategy perspective? Because I see a lot of organizations struggle with roles just in general. They're like, oh, we want to be an RBAC, shop, for lack of a better word. And they get some percentage of the way down the journey, and then they stop making progress. If I'm going into a greenfield situation where we really haven't started anything yet, I've always been more of a fan of the attribute-based side of things because I feel like it's a little easier to start up, set up, because you say, okay, well, what are some key attributes? Are you an employee or are you not an employee? Okay, well, if you're an employee, you get this. And now we've got some sort of access control with that. And maybe you start to combine a few different attributes. And for a long time, I'm glad Jim asked the question because I thought ABAC and PBAC were the same thing. It was just PBAC was the marketing term, and because, I don't know, ABAC wasn't sexy enough. I don't know. But as I've learned more over the years, it's like, okay, I get it. If I'm going into an organization and I have not yet taken the journey towards any sort of consistent access control method, any of the BACs, could I start with policy-based access control, PBAC? Or are there prerequisites to be able to be successful from a policy standpoint versus attribute or a role-based perspective?
Yeah, so I think you should start with policy-based access control. I think it is a core component of any modernized IAM infrastructure. But you need to understand you can't do without roles, and I'll explain. Okay, you gave an example where you're leveraging HR data to make decisions, but it's not enough, right? We can't make all decisions just on what HR knows, and we also understand that HR doesn't get it always right.
No, come on. Identity data is always pristine and never needs to be cleaned.
I was also thinking of a scenario like, let's say you wanted to have an authorization based on, you can only access this if you have more than $100,000 of assets under management, right? Well, that's not data that you would want. You wouldn't want the person's account balance in your IAM system but you'd want the ability to apply that rule. They get the access because yes or no, right?
Yes, exactly, and that's another key component which needs to be well known, right? PBAC is not just about those dynamic, fine-grained decisions. Eventually, authorizations are not implemented just one way. There are so many ways authorizations are implemented today, and even if we want for a standard to be out there, it would take some time, if at all. We need to be able to manage authorizations for application level security. We need to do the same for APIs, for microservices, for data. And we can't say one fits all, right? Doesn't work that way. That's the advantage of PBAC. They enable you to manage the decisions in a consistent way, regardless if it is for data access control, API access control, microservice access control, and that's important. That is a key component. PBAC does not enforce technology. PBAC is a method of management with many options of enforcement.
All right, I'm going to pull us a little bit into a rabbit hole, but I promise I'll stop. But I would imagine a scenario where, let's take that example I had where, people can only access a certain portal if they have $100,000 under management. So assumably that would be some kind of like web service call to some system that would say, Jim has the assets or he doesn't have the assets. Ideally, that's in real time, but you can see the potential hang up if that's in real time. So you have to probably stage that data, which is always like why virtual directories existed in the first place, right? So I would imagine that's one of the real challenges when it comes to authorization is like, okay, how often do I refresh my data that I'm going to base this policy decision on?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? That's how we used to do authorizations. But now I believe you would find there are more advanced ways. There are actually 4 patterns to authorizations. And that's also, I don't know if it's a well-known fact, but in the old standards, there was just permit deny. So you could ask that question, can I approve this transaction, which is more or less than $1 million, and get a yes, no. But that's really inefficient, and you need to go refresh your data over and over again, right? Today, there are more patterns like I mentioned, patterns for authorizations. In addition to permit deny, we also have entitlement resolution, which is an open-ended question, right? What are the list of capabilities a user can do within this session? People might even consider that as login time authorization, right? To support the authorizations per login session. There's also a resource resolution or asset resolution, which is the same question in Traverse. Per a specific asset, user resolution it's called. What are the list of users per asset? And the most interesting one, which is, I think, the answer to the example you gave, it's called policy resolution. And this is the decision that handles data. Because you do not have to ask a permit deny per transaction. You don't need to do that. You need to put your controls, in that case, on the data level. And therefore, the data which a user can see is only the data the policy enables him to see. Not by transaction, by filtering the data the user can actually access. Implementing those within your overall architecture provides you the best authorization solution and obviously security in place.
So that gives a good background, I think, of PBAC and what it is today, right? We want to talk about how things are going to be in the future. And one of the things that I'd like to know would be, do you see PBAC overtaking RBAC in the future? And let me just, before you start answering that, I feel like, and I don't know if Jeff really agrees with this because we've kind of gotten into it on this topic before, but I think that the popularity of RBAC is what it is because people understand it. I've got this role and I put people in the role and then they get this access. I get that. Or if it's a dynamic role, it's, I take the data and I plug it in. I understand that. All right. And it's auditable and my auditors like it. Now, I think PBAC's challenge, I think it's much stronger. I think it has much more capabilities, but I don't think people understand it, right? We're here on the Identity Center podcast, and I'm learning a lot. Just listening to you, I'm learning a lot. So how does this information get out there? And no, bringing it back to the simple question, do you see PBAC overtaking our BAC in the future?
So, no, I don't. And also, I want to emphasize, this is not a war between PBAC and ABAC or RBAC. They are all needed in order to support the advanced authorization requirements organizations have today. Let me go back to the example you provided. Yes, you are assigning a role to a user, and that's simple to understand. But now let's ask the question, what does that role entitle the user to do? Who makes that decision? You are a doctor. Okay, what can you do? Can you see your patient records? Can you approve some kind of subscription? That is authorization, and that's the difference, and that's what needs to be understood by the broader audience. You still need roles because you need to give some title or some, information which is personally assigned to a user. But the decision which is attached to that role, the logic which is attached to that role, that is authorization. It takes the role and explains the role to the application resources, to the data, to whatever.
PBAC is still a concept of like centralization though, right? I mean, we're not talking about at the app, because to me, it's like if you have a great orchestration of what you should have access to in these applications, but then when you get to the application, they have three roles, three, very simple levels of what you can do within the application. Well, getting to a least privilege model is pretty difficult or impossible, right?
Well, if you just rely on roles, then yes. But let's talk about least privilege. What is least privilege? What is that? What does that mean? It means that you can access whatever resources at a specific point of. To begin with, you do not have access, obviously, but you're getting access when you need it to the specific function or resource, whatever. Right now. What is identity first? What is identity aware? What is zero trust? Aren't they all saying basically the same thing? When access is made, let's understand who the user is. Let's make the decision if this access can be granted and to what level. They're all eventually talking about the same concept, the same notions. Access should be much more advanced. It should be dynamic. It should be smart. However marketing terms you want to put on top of that. Make the decision for a user in the context of the access at the time of access. Obviously where possible, or as close to access as possible. Right?
I mean, make it sound so easy, but it's hard, right? I mean, if we think about it in the real world, authorizations are a mess for a lot of companies.
Yes, it is.
Even if you just look at Active Directory, naming conventions don't make any sense. Incomplete memberships are off. You've got nested groups. Now you start taking that problem and adding in every other application and trying to come up with, well, what is the policy for someone across 20, 30, 40, 50 different applications? Maybe the end system doesn't support that granular.
Yeah.
From an authorization standpoint.
Most probably it doesn't. You are absolutely right. But you know what? That's the chicken and egg here, right? It's always like that with technology. Think about SSO. SSO today is authentication. If you're saying authentication today, everyone in the space would it automatically think about IDP and OpenID to connect or SAML, depending where you are. That's given. That's even a commodity today. But going back 10, 15 years, that was not the case. I still remember trying to convince application owners where I worked to connect to Active Directory or later on to connect to whatever IDP I had in place. No, we don't want to speak with your authentication system. We have built-in authentication system.
Because if your system goes down, my application's not available.
Exactly.
And people get mad at me. They don't yell at you, they yell at me.
And you can't control the experience to the level that they think that they want to.
That's where, I mean, a common organizational struggle where, to me, it's like too much decision making has been delegated out to, the business unit or the application teams, where it's like if you can't get buy-in around a simple concept like authentication, then you're in a position where you can't really push anything.
Well, to Gal's point, though, single sign-on was in the same boat
Exactly.
15, 20 years ago, and it took time, as it always does, right? We talk about cycles, and some organizations are agile and can be, and some aren't. It takes time to build in that functionality. Authorizations, I don't know if I've seen as much of a shift towards, we do need to build in more granular permissions. Sometimes you see it. Sometimes it's hidden behind extra licensing or subscription costs that SaaS products like to charge extra for a team license, right? Or something like that versus an individual seat or something like that. How do we get applications to get on board with, having more flexibility from an authorization standpoint to be able to enable stuff like this?
Yeah, so like I said, it's a chicken and egg. You need to start somewhere. Where would you start? With the newer technology, with the new developments, right? To consider an organization which currently takes big monolith applications and converts them to microservices, which is a common theme, right? A lot of organizations are going through that transition. How do you provide authorizations for microservices? Would you go develop that by yourself? If in the past, developers, they said, I want to own that code. I don't want you to tell me what to do. Once you move to microservices, that's not the case. Each microservice owner wants to be responsible on the business logic of his small microservice. Authorization should be a service, like authentication, provided to all those microservices. So this is like a very good opportunity to start thinking. Don't boil the ocean. Don't try to take care of all your legacy applications. That for sure would not work. But look at new development, new initiative which you are onboarding. So that would be one. Second, I see more vendors like COTS SaaS applications supporting built-in policies. And that's another opportunity there, right? So the market is evolving, still slowly, but it is evolving. I think we are seeing a very similar path to what happened with SSO, with single sign-on. Yes, it's more complex, but also more interesting.
Well, it's a fundamental shift to the way we do things.
Yeah.
Just like MFA was a fundamental shift to authentication, it's very difficult to change how we do authorizations in a short time period. If you're building a new application, to your point, yes, you can do that. If you're on a RACF mainframe, which we've been saying, is going to die for, 30 years, and now all of a sudden it's hot again. You can't find people who know how to do it. There's these great cycles, and sometimes the answer is no. We're just not going to do that because the cost is too great to invest to re-architect an application. When it comes time to replace the application, let's take this as something that we want to consider as part of the purchase decision, which is why I love having identity have a seat at the table for new applications coming in, having some sort of standards. Don't go buy a product that doesn't integrate with open standards to do authentication. Don't go buy a product that doesn't set us up for future success from an authorization standpoint either. Maybe doesn't have as much cachet right now from a purchasing decision standpoint, but it should be something that identity teams out there who are listening and who have influence over steering committees or architecture review boards or whatever, political thing exists within an organization to say, yes, we're going to get that app. These are the things that they should be aware of when they're making a decision. No one goes out and says, I'm going to buy this thing and I never will be able to connect it to my Active Directory. Oh my gosh, why not?
Exactly. And you know what? You touched another very important point. Absolutely agree with you. Identity people, they need to be part of that discussion. Today, there's a bit of disconnect, right? Application owners, they're doing what they want. AppSec, DataSec is not connected to the identity space. And that leaves a very big gap there because authorization, eventually, if you think about that, authorization takes all the efforts which organizations have placed into identity and access management, well-defined identities, well-managed identities, well-authenticated identities, and brings all that effort into the application space, into the data space. but they need to sit together on the same table in order for that to happen.
I'm going to ask a side question here because it came up this morning as part of the opening keynote for this morning about the role of potentially having something like a chief identity officer and having a seat at the table at basically the C-suite. So right there with CPOs and CTOs and all the C people. Where do you stand on that? Because I thought it was an interesting discussion this morning, the panel with Andy Hindle, Ian Glazer, and Claire something. I'm good at
Claire
butchering
Nelson?
names. No, someone else. There was a couple other folks. I forget all the names. I really apologize. Sorry. I should have been more prepared to ask this question, but it just occurred to me as I'm thinking about it here. Do you think now is a good time to have a chief identity officer sitting at the board level or reporting to a board like those other roles might be? Or do you have a different perspective on it?
So I haven't thought about that too much, but I do believe it should roll under security. Because why would you do that? Why would you do authentication? Why would you do authorization? And the reason is security in many cases. And eventually, all of those technologies are a means to an end. And the end is the business objective of the organization, not having multi-factor authentication or well-defined authorization. That really doesn't matter to anyone. They want the organization to perform according to its business objective. And to do that, they need support of security and IAM. That's the way I currently see that, but still new to the concept.
So I'm going to try to turn this into a question, but during Andre's keynote, he talked about, okay, well, really what's important is like, I kind of feel like our industry has done a pretty good job on the authentication side. When you can see what's happening with it, it's like, oh, it's getting better and better in terms of validating that the person or potentially the non-human being is who they say they are, they can authenticate. The problem now that we need to solve is on the authorization side. And in my mind, where I was going with this was like the over-provisioned account problem, right? Which kind of I'm pulling back to the statement, it's not RBAC versus PBAC. And I agree with that because I feel like PBAC is, in this context, kind of like the scalpel, whereas RBAC is kind of like the sledgehammer or the axe, right? It's like you have 200 applications. You're probably not going to do PBAC for all 200 applications, but for your big ones, it's like that's where we use the scalpel. We've got to really, this is my idea anyway. So I think that over-provisioned account problem, because you have all these accounts sitting dormant, they've got all this access. If those accounts get hijacked somehow, now they've got tons of access that they didn't really need to have in the first place. And I think RBAC puts you in a position that that's what's going to happen. I think PBAC is kind of like more like on the fly decision. So it's not like over provisioned accounts sitting there with that access. Do you see things that way? Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah. And I think it's an evolution, not a revolution. And that's part of what you have mentioned. PBAC does not replace any of the other stuff which is there. PBAC makes them better. So yes, we have over-provisioned accounts. The reason being, that's how applications operate today. Applications, the majority of them, do not know how to operate without that account being there. And we do see newer applications having that ability, which is great, in my opinion. But that's, again, an evolution which PBAC supports. RBAC cannot support that. PBAC can support that. But that's the combination of both that enable that to actually happen.
I like to think of myself as pragmatic, right? And this is where I think ABAC has a role, because you may get into a situation where with your IDP, you're integrating many applications, and it's easier just to pass them the attributes that they want. It's not social security numbers, it's not bank account balances, and fine, you guys want to take the attributes and determine what parts of your application pragmatically speaking, I'm just going to pass that. So to me, that's where ABAC, or if you don't have a PBAC tool, that might end up being your answer. I feel like if you're going to go down the PBAC route, it's more of, as somebody delivering this authorization service to the organization, you have to have more of a partnership with the application teams to make sure that you're applying these policies correctly, putting people into the right roles correctly. I mean, of course you have to put them in the right roles, but it made me think of where we were with authorization maybe a decade ago, which was XACML, right? The XACML standard. And I always felt like the XACML standard was, I didn't see very many organizations implementing it because, back to your original point, it was hard enough to get application teams many times to give up authorization, right? And maybe I'm just thinking of a point in time where I had to physically deal with trying to get a bunch of applications with different application owners and their own agendas to get onto a common authentication platform. That was really hard. But then to get them to give up authorization where you're making the decision whether or not the end user can see a screen within their application, it's like, no way, not happening. You're not qualified to make that decision. And to me, that's where XACML would put you. Now, to me, there was a use case for that. If you had a situation where, you were a security first organization and you absolutely had to have a paper trail in a central location of what people could access and did access, that put you in a good position to do that. But it feels like nobody talks about XACML anymore.
Which is a good thing. No, I'm just, okay. So I think XACML meant well, and it's a good, it was a good evolvement of the market to start speaking about authorizations. I also believe that is part of the reason people are afraid from authorization, just because of XACML and the complexity it brought in. But XACML is not the only method for authorization management, certainly not for authorization enforcement. There are many new developments today, and we can see them all over the place, like OPA, which is an open standard. Amazon SADA, we have other development as well there. And I think that those are all good indications because it means there is a need. What we started with, maybe XACML, was not good enough, was too complex for us, and looking for new options. And that's good. That's the evolution the market is currently going through. We need to, I would say, shake out that XACML bad notion. Maybe to some areas, XACML is still okay. It's still good. From my personal perspective, do not see organizations now adopting XACML for new implementations.
Does it seem like a lot of the concepts from XACML still exist, like policy decision point, policy enforcement point,
Absolutely.
policy administration point? Like, to me, those were like, oh yeah, that helped me understand authorization.
Yes.
I think those concepts are still, they still apply, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that is certainly a very important contributor of the XACML standard to put in place those main elements of an authorization solution. But let's not get too much in love with that, because we are seeing that the solution eventually can be more distributed. For example, we cannot force all technologies to outreach to the PDP, the policy decision point. That's not how it works today. So we need to understand those are separate components that can reside in the technology itself, not just in the authorization solution. And that's how we need to look at it.
Maybe I got the nuance that you're talking about there, the distribution, which I think is kind of like, okay, if you're talking about a PBAC system, you have the IDP that's somewhere in the chain of passing the person to the application as an authenticated user. It's doing some call to that PBAC system to give me the authorizations. I'm going to stick these in the information that I'm sending to the application.
Yes. For example, that would be one example, and it's a good example. It's not against how authorization should be treated, because, again, there is a technology that needs to consume the authorizations. We can't force the technology how to work. We can't force the application to call out each and every time it needs a decision. That failed. It didn't prove itself. So we need to be more flexible. By we, I'm saying the authorization solution. The authorization solution should be flexible to accommodate the different technology requirements. Application that needs everything in advance, an application that needs more elaborated decision, that is fine. Eventually, the objective is to be able to see the decisions, to manage them in a centralized way, to be able to govern and audit all those authorization policies. That's what we want to achieve, not the underlying technology which controls enforcement.
There's so much to unpack here.
Well, we can do some more podcasts on each and every one of those topics.
You're definitely going to have to come back, but I know we've got different engagements that we all need to get to probably here in a little bit. So we'll probably start to wrap things up. But I want to close this out with a lightning round, something where I'm going to say something and you give me your gut reaction or prediction or whatever you'd like to go off of it. So it's kind of a dealer's choice since we're in Vegas. RBAC and PBAC, what comes to mind?
Authorizations.
That was kind of a softball, just to get things warmed up. Zero trust.
Wide concept, need to be better understood in the market.
Artificial intelligence.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Future.
And one I'm just going to throw in, blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely believe
You're a big
that.
believer?
Yes, I am.
What do you think is the killer app, the killer use case for blockchain other than cryptocurrency?
Okay, so not allowed to talk about crypto. Understood.
You can if you want, but
No, well, there are many. There are many, and I think decentralized identity comes into mind because that's the space I'm in. I think it would be very interesting to see how that would evolve, having each person own its own identity and the data which is associated with his identity, and having the ability to share that, not as, just one package, but in a more smart way. And certainly,
I want to go back to artificial intelligence for a minute, because relative to authorization, I think is a big opportunity for AI, which is, again, with these over-provisioned accounts, to be able to crunch the data of you have this access, but you're using this access, so therefore all this other access you don't really need, we could take it away. One of the things I've been kind of churning on is, well, if you don't write those rules very carefully, so let's say you haven't used this access in 6 months, you don't need it. Well, what about like annual reviews? Like you do the annual reviews of people annually. What if that got taken away in August because you hadn't used it in a year? Not a good thing, right?
Yeah, it happens all the time. You're on cycles.
That is true. It happens anyway, right?
So how do we get smarter about that? Maybe
we got to get smarter.
Maybe there's a way to say, hey, we're, because of the time of year, an attribute or a policy comes up and says, for people who don't normally carry this access throughout the year, but we know it's a busy time of the season, maybe we're ramping up password reset support because we still are killing the password 20 years later. Things like that, where you have more of a dynamic or ephemeral access policy where it only exists when you need it. And because you have the data to be able to predetermine when you're going to need it. We know that it's going to be a spike in something, or we know that we're going to kick off a certification. All the people who don't carry the access, kick it on for the access owners or whatever it may be. I think there's ways to go with that.
No, that's a
See, now
good
we're
point.
getting into AI at the center again.
Yeah, we've been told our podcast is becoming AI at the center. That could be a compliment.
I mean, we can't ignore it. I mean, it's everywhere here at Identiverse. People are thinking about it. We've got to figure out how we're going to work with it. It's not going to go away.
I think we, at some point in the last 2 years, the name identity at the center kind of finally hit like, oh my God, genius. Like you guys saw this coming. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, here's what I say. We used to call it identity the center. People say identity is the new perimeter. And then we're at the identity is everywhere conference. So it's just identity.
All right, let's end on a lighter note. What's been your favorite Identiverse experience so far this week?
Okay, so there are many events here and discussion panels and so on. I was primarily in meetings, so I'm just being locked in a meeting room to speak with customers. That's what I do. So I would say my favorite experience was the pizza place. I really like pizza.
Oh, okay. Which pizza place? The one here?
That's where I saw you, Gal.
Yes, exactly. That's where we met on that first day.
Yeah. What did you end up ordering to eat?
Well,
what's on your pizza?
Basic, the Napolitana, like they call it Italy Love, something like that. Just plain traditional pizza.
Oh, like the margarita.
Yeah, margarita, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I actually went to this place to get pizza and I wound up getting chicken parm. And I don't regret that decision one bit. It was fantastic.
I had margarita pizza on Monday when I flew in. So
hey, of course, we're in Vegas.
Yeah. Jim, what's been your favorite experience?
So last night we went out on this party bus with my friends from Accents. Thank you to them. They had that Jason Stratham impersonator. By the way, his real first name is Jason. Jason Stanley is his real name. Very cool guy. And what I realized was when you get a bunch of IT people together, right, we're kind of like a tame crowd. So having somebody like him kind of like get everybody dancing and doing their thing was really cool. So party bus kind of sounds a little intimidating, which is, I think, why probably they didn't have a bigger crowd than they had. But, I mean, we basically took a bus, and they had some, like an open bar on the bus. We took this bus to the Welcome to Las Vegas sign, which is like everybody knows it. And then we went to the Fremont Street Experience. They had an outdoor concert. I mean, so if you need a recommendation, I think next time I come to Las Vegas, either spend some extra non-business time or come here on a vacation. Fremont Street looks like that's my speed, man. Like, they've got the $11.99 steak and lobster dinner. They've got open concerts, and it's techno wizardry. Like, you think Times Square or the Strip here is like neon. Go there. You feel like it's full daytime because they have an overhead TV that's bigger than one I've ever seen before, and just like great, fantastic experience. So, yeah, last night.
Sounds like
How
fun.
about you, Jeff?
It's a lot of little moments. Walking through the hall, seeing people that I haven't seen before, being able to thank guests that we've had on the show that we haven't been able to meet in person over the years. I don't know what it is, but I guess I'm not as approachable as you, because I know you have always had people coming up saying, hey, listen to the show and for that, which is very cool. We always appreciate all our listeners. I had one last night, which was great. I was walking back to my hotel room, and I think his name was John, hopefully it was John, from Transmit. He's like, hey, Jeff, I listened to the podcast. Like, oh, very cool. Thank you very much. So you're definitely the more social butterfly, but little interactions like that I think are very cool, and being able to kind of talk with folks like that.
Yeah. Like, well, half of it is like me grabbing people that I've known over the years. I saw Brian Rossi in the vendor hall, and, we go back a long time, and back from his ForgeRock days. Mm-hmm. He left ForgeRock, and now he's back at ForgeRock. So, yeah, it's great seeing him, and he's supposed to come out and do karaoke tonight, so we'll see.
Well, you're supposed to sing something tonight. You still haven't told me what your song's going to be.
Denise hasn't told me what my song's going to be.
Well, I won't be singing, so hopefully people come out and join me on the bench watching.
There you go. Hey, I think you guys will have just as much fun, if not more.
Definitely. All right, let's go ahead and wrap it up for this one. Gal, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. For folks who are interested, we'll have links in our show notes, but you can check out PlainID.com to learn more about what you guys are doing in space, which is very cool. We'll also have a link to Gal's profile on LinkedIn, so you can connect with her and tell her why she's right or wrong when it comes to, I guess, anything, but probably something identity related is what I'm guessing. We're on the web, idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter at idacpodcast. Mastodon at IDAC.
Do we still have Mastodon?
I still post. We have 1 or 2 people who sort of engage on that side and like and favorite posts. We definitely help appreciate that. Our friend Chris is one of those. So I basically do it for Chris.
You do it
for the
for
most part.
Chris
at this point.
Powers?
Yeah, Chris Powers. But yeah, we're on Mastodon at IDAC Podcast at infosec.exchange. And obviously you can always connect with Jim and I. We got a lot of interesting things coming up. I think I want to get into a little more around this chief identity officer role. And Jim and I are going to kind of spitball some ideas and think about how to tap that.
We've got Ian.
Ian's coming up next here.
Next episode, yeah.
Yep. So that would be a good one to spring a board off of maybe. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So subscribe, like all the cool, fun things that, people like you to do when you're listening to podcasts. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.